Lana Stevens had never planned on returning to her father's ranch. Not after everything that had happened. Yet, there she was, gripping the worn leather of the old steering wheel, the late afternoon sun bleeding across the hood of her truck as she turned down the gravel road that curved toward the property line. The place hadn't changed much since she was a child. The tall fence posts, slightly leaning after years of neglect, still marked the borders of the land. The wind whispered through the barley and bent the prairie grass like a sigh, and beyond the southern gate the silhouette of the barn stood against the sky, rusted but proud. It was home. At least it had been once. Now it felt more like a challenge, a battleground waiting to be claimed. After her father's passing 2 years ago, Lana had put off the decision for as long as she could. There were legal matters, of course. The probate process, title transfer, land reassessment. And then there was Sophie. Her daughter had barely been 7 when the accident happened. A car crash that killed Lana's husband and left Sophie with deep trauma and sensory processing issues. The nightmares came in waves, unrelenting and cruel, and so did the meltdowns. For a long time, they had lived in the city, trying therapy after therapy, hoping each school would be the one that understood, each counselor the one who could reach her. But nothing truly helped until Rocky. Rocky, the golden Labrador, wasn't just a pet. He was trained, certified, and recognized as a service animal under federal law. He could sense shifts in Sophie's behavior before Lana could. He knew how to interrupt a spiral, how to offer pressure when the world became too loud. He slept beside her bed, waited outside the bathroom door, and watched every new stranger with the protective gaze of a seasoned guardian. When Lana inherited the ranch, 120 acres of grassland, hills, and forested edge, along with a broken-down house and a forgotten herd of federally protected Welsh bulls her father had fought to reintroduce into the region, it seemed impossible to imagine starting over out there, but something about it kept calling to her. Maybe it was the quiet, maybe the space, or maybe it was the idea of giving Sophie a place where she could exist without being judged. The decision to move was not taken lightly. Lana sold everything they didn't need. She packed their lives into a trailer, lined up appointments with vets, inspectors, and ranch hands, and made contact with the Department of Agriculture, which still tracked the bulls through a conservation grant tied to endangered genetics. Her father had been part of a program to protect the breed. Proud, thick-shouldered animals with dark coats and slow, deliberate movements. The grant required land maintenance and occasional tagging, but in exchange, the government provided legal protections for the animals and federal oversight of any disputes involving the livestock or the land they roamed. What Lana didn't expect, or rather, what she didn't fully understand, was that even in a place this remote, she wasn't alone. The neighbor to the east was Karen Murray. From the moment Lana first pulled up the driveway that crossed near the fence line, Karen had been watching. That first day, she stood beside a freshly planted hydrangea bush wearing white linen slacks and a pastel blouse like she'd just stepped out of a resort catalog. She had a glass of wine in one hand and a disapproving frown stitched neatly across her face. The smile she forced as Lana waved was more of a grimace, and even from 50 feet away, Lana could tell it wasn't going to be a neighborly kind of relationship. Karen made her presence known quickly. The day after Lana and Sophie moved in, Karen showed up uninvited, knocking on the door just after breakfast. She looked around with the critical eye of someone conducting an audit, her gaze pausing on the service dog, the dusty porch, and the barely standing chicken coop in the back. "I just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood," she said in a tone that managed to sound more like a warning than a greeting. Then she looked at Rocky. "But I hope you've checked our community guidelines. We've always had a no-pets rule here. It keeps things clean." Lana smiled, polite but firm. Rocky's not a pet. He's a federally recognized service animal. He's allowed under the ADA. Karen's smile didn't move. "Well," she said, her tone dripping with syrup, "sometimes rules don't quite fit everyone. I suppose that's what makes life so complicated. That was how it began. Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was the self-appointed enforcer of order. She ran the local committee that managed everything from fence heights to grass color. She had a file for everyone. She knew when you parked wrong, left your lights on, or didn't sign a waiver for tree trimming. And while Lana's land was legally outside the jurisdiction of any residential agreement, that didn't stop Karen from pretending otherwise. Complaints started showing up. Calls from animal control about aggressive livestock, letters suggesting that Rocky had bitten someone he hadn't, and unmarked cars slowing as they drove past the ranch house at night. Still, Lana endured. She fixed the barn roof herself, hired a wildlife consultant to inspect the bulls, and fenced off the north pasture to give the animals space to roam. Sophie adjusted slowly, helped by the open sky and the rhythm of the land. She began painting again. She smiled more often, and at night she fell asleep with Rocky curled up beside her and no fear in her eyes. The ranch was working. For a brief moment, Lana believed they might finally be safe. That illusion shattered the morning 2 armed men walked through her gate. It was early, the sun barely risen. Lana had just fed the bulls and was returning to the house when she heard gravel crunching near the east fence. 2 men in camouflage, both carrying rifles, were standing by the tree line, looking toward the pasture. "Excuse me," Lana called, her voice sharp. They turned, surprised to see her. One of them stepped forward. "We got permission," he said, holding up a folded map. "Karen said this land's part of the seasonal hunting grounds. We're just after some wild hogs." Lana stared at him, her mind racing. "This is private land. Federally protected livestock roam this area. You need to leave, now." They hesitated, confused, but one of them nodded. "Sorry, she told us something different." Lana didn't wait. She called the sheriff. What followed was a mix of apology and evasion. The sheriff's deputy listened, took a report, and left with a shrug. The hunters had claimed they were misinformed. No charges, just a misunderstanding. But it wasn't a mistake. The map they carried had a boundary line that excluded Lana's parcel. Exactly the kind of thing someone might forge with just enough plausible deniability. Lana didn't sleep that night. She sat on the porch with Rocky at her feet, watching the road, watching the shadows. Karen's house lights stayed off, but Lana knew. She felt it, the edge of something shifting. This wasn't about a dog anymore. This wasn't about grass length or property values. This was personal. Someone was trying to push her off the land. And next time, they wouldn't send confused men with maps. Next time, they'd send something worse. She stood, her muscles aching, and looked out at the pasture where the bulls moved slowly through the fog. They didn't know they were protected. They didn't know someone had declared war over a fence line. But Lana did, and she wasn't going anywhere. Not now, not ever. Lana didn't expect the fallout from the hunting incident to escalate immediately. She thought maybe the deputy's presence, even if it hadn't resulted in charges, would send a message. She assumed Karen would retreat for a time, realizing that tampering with federally protected land came with consequences. For a week, it seemed she was right. The road was quiet. No more trespassers appeared. The bulls continued their slow, grazing march across the pasture, oblivious to the human chess match playing out around them. Sophie returned to her daily rhythm, drawing on the back porch, doing homeschool lessons on Lana's tablet, taking long walks with Rocky along the western fence line. Lana almost allowed herself to believe the worst had passed. But on a Wednesday morning, the illusion shattered with a letter slipped into the mailbox. No postage, no official seal, just her name printed in all caps. She read it, standing in the driveway, the sun barely over the trees. The note was typed, anonymous, but the phrasing was unmistakably Karen's. "We urge you to reconsider keeping a dangerous animal on the property, especially with a child present. There are legal liabilities associated with such negligence, and further infractions may result in community enforcement measures. Lana blinked at the word community, feeling the slow build of fury in her chest. There was no community enforcement in rural unincorporated counties. There was the law, and there was vigilantism, and it was increasingly clear which side Karen was gravitating toward. She didn't reply. Instead, she scanned the fence line for signs of intrusion and spent the next 3 hours checking every gate, lock, and camera battery on the property. She rerouted the outdoor motion sensors and installed a second trail cam near the eastern tree line where the hunters had entered. Rocky followed her everywhere, silent and alert, as if he too sensed the shift. That evening, Lana called her attorney in the city, a woman named Taylor Harding who had helped with the inheritance paperwork. Lana explained the hunting incident, the doctored maps, and now the threatening letter. Taylor listened without interrupting, then said quietly, "You need to document everything. Dates, times, photos, letters. Build a timeline. If this escalates into a legal battle, we'll need a clean, factual narrative. And if anything crosses into criminal activity, you call me first and the sheriff second. In that order." The next morning, Sophie found something odd near the mailbox. A small pile of what looked like liver, cut into cubes and wrapped in plastic. At first, Lana thought it might have been discarded bait, maybe dropped by a raccoon or coyote. But when she lifted the packet with gloved hands, she noticed a faint chemical smell. She didn't say anything to Sophie, who was already unsettled, but she put the package in a sealed container and drove it to the vet's office in town. The test results came back 48 hours later. Rat poison and traces of antifreeze. It was bait, all right. Someone had left it where Rocky might find it. Lana called Taylor again. This time, her voice shook. They tried to poison him. It was meant for Rocky. Taylor didn't offer platitudes. She said, "We're past the point of letters. You need to file a report and contact the Department of Agriculture. If anyone harms that dog, it's not just a local offense. It's a violation of federal ADA law." Lana drove straight to the sheriff's office, armed with the test report and photos. The deputy on duty took her seriously, made copies, and logged the complaint. But he also said, not unkindly, "We can't patrol the fence line 24 hours a day, ma'am. You may want to consider a security firm, just until things settle." That night, Lana lay awake, staring at the ceiling while the wind clawed against the house. Outside, Rocky dozed near the door, ears twitching at every sound. Sophie was asleep upstairs, her room reinforced with blackout curtains and white noise. Lana kept the house dark and the porch lights off, watching the tree line from the kitchen window. At 3:17 a.m., one of the motion sensors tripped near the pasture. The floodlight snapped on, illuminating a sliver of field. Nothing moved. But when Lana checked the trail cam the next morning, she saw it. 2 blurred figures, hunched and quick, moving along the fence with flashlights. They didn't try to enter. They didn't touch the gate. But they were close enough to see the bulls, and close enough to be seen themselves. Lana sent the footage to Taylor, who immediately contacted the Department of Agriculture's Enforcement Division. A federal field officer was assigned, and within 72 hours an agent named Raul Vega showed up at the ranch. He was soft-spoken, efficient, and meticulous. He walked the perimeter with Lana, reviewed the camera footage, and asked about every incident in detail, from the trespassing hunters to the poisoned bait. When she mentioned Karen by name, he didn't flinch. "I've seen this before," he said. "People get territorial. They don't understand what protected means until a judge explains it to them." He advised Lana to post updated signage under the federal program. "Do not trespass. Endangered species habitat. Federal offense." He also recommended motion-triggered floodlights with cellular alerts and suggested she file for an official protective easement through the Wildlife Bureau, which would limit public access near the breeding area and make enforcement easier. Lana took his advice and began the process immediately. The easement would take a month to process, but once approved, it would give her legal authority to bar access to the eastern section of the ranch where the bulls roamed. Karen's response came in the form of a flyer, posted on community bulletin boards and emailed to a local newsletter list. Property dispute raises safety. Concerns: local mother resists neighborhood efforts to control aggressive animals. Neighbors report fear for children and pets. The article didn't mention Lana by name, but it didn't have to. The description was unmistakable. Lana stared at the screen, her jaw clenched as Sophie sat nearby reading. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a campaign. Taylor warned her that defamation cases were tricky, especially without named sources, but it did open another avenue: coordinated character assassination. Lana began receiving strange phone calls, survey requests asking about her incident, anonymous voicemails whispering that maybe it's time to move on. One night, a delivery van arrived with 20 bags of garden lime she hadn't ordered. The receipt listed her name, but not her credit card. She sent it back, but the message was clear: "You're being watched." Then came the worst of it. One morning, Rocky failed to return from his usual perimeter check. Lana called for him, searched the barn, the porch, the tree line. Nothing. Sophie began to panic, pacing the kitchen and clinging to her drawing pad. Lana jumped in the truck and drove the fence line, scanning ditches and clearings until finally she spotted him, tied to a tree with a heavy chain, half a mile from the eastern gate. He was dehydrated, limping, and someone had shaved a patch of his fur to reveal a crude insult carved into the skin with clippers. Lana's hands shook as she unfastened him. Rocky didn't whimper. He leaned against her, steady and quiet, his eyes wide and trusting. That night, she didn't call the sheriff. She called Taylor, who connected her directly to the Department of Justice's ADA enforcement unit. The situation had gone beyond local or even state jurisdiction. What was happening on her land? Targeting a child's service animal, attempting to influence control of federally protected livestock, falsifying documents, orchestrating coordinated harassment, was now the concern of the federal government. Lana didn't feel victorious. She felt exhausted. But when she sat down to write the full incident report, reviewing photos and timestamps, recording voice memos for the ADA investigators, and preparing a list of all neighbors who had previously expressed support or suspicion, she felt something deeper: resolve. She wasn't going anywhere. And if Karen wanted a war, she had just declared it on the wrong woman. The weeks that followed Rocky's abduction were shaped by an electric kind of stillness. Lana felt like she was living inside a taut wire. Any sudden movement might cause everything to snap. The return of the service dog had not calmed Sophie as much as she'd hoped. The girl no longer ventured outside without Lana or Rocky by her side, and her appetite had diminished to picking at toast. At night, Lana would sometimes find her curled into Rocky's side on the floor instead of in bed. The veterinarian had cleared Rocky physically, though the trauma lingered in his behavior. He was more alert, slower to settle, and reactive to shadows that previously would not have bothered him. Whatever had happened during his disappearance had left an impression on all of them. And, despite the growing folder of evidence Lana had passed on to Taylor and the federal agents, no arrests had been made. No charges filed. There were no fingerprints on the chain, no footage from that part of the property, and the sheriff's office had deferred entirely to the federal agency now overseeing the situation. Lana had expected a confrontation from Karen by now, or at least a veiled threat disguised as a neighborly visit. But Karen had vanished, at least physically. Her house remained dark during the day, with blinds drawn and a "for sale" sign placed half-heartedly near the driveway. But Lana knew better than to believe she was truly gone. The tactics had changed, not ceased. A neighbor named Ruth, who had always kept her distance before, approached Lana one afternoon while she was fixing a fence post. Ruth wore sunglasses and carried a tote bag like she had just returned from a harmless walk, but her voice trembled when she leaned in and said, "They're not done, you know. Just careful now. It's not just her. There's talk. They want that land. The bulls are an excuse." She looked around once, nervously, then walked away before Lana could ask anything more. Taylor confirmed what Lana had begun to suspect. A land developer had made contact with several members of the local land committee, the informal but influential group Karen controlled. There was speculation that they planned to build an eco-resort or private hunting club on parcels adjacent to Lana's ranch, and the bulls, and the protected status of the land they roamed, were an obstacle. The scheme was familiar to Taylor, who had handled similar cases elsewhere in the state. "They pressure vulnerable owners to sell," she explained. "They use noise complaints, zoning challenges, fake environmental disputes, until the owner either gives in or gets pushed out. But in your case, you have federal protections. That complicates things for them. So they escalate in other ways." Escalate they did. One morning, Lana awoke to find survey flags hammered into the eastern field, bright orange and pink, fluttering beside the creek that cut through her pasture. She hadn't authorized any survey. She immediately contacted Raul Vega, the federal field agent. He arrived by mid-afternoon, inspected the markers, and made several calls. It turned out that a private firm had filed for a terrain inspection under the guise of planning a water drainage upgrade for neighboring properties. The application had not included her parcel, yet the team had crossed the fence and placed stakes on her federally protected land. Raul looked genuinely angry for the first time since she'd met him. "This isn't just careless anymore," he said. "This is orchestrated, deliberate." He filed a violation report and warned the surveying company that entering again without clearance would result in legal action. But even as he drove away, Lana could tell he didn't believe the intrusion would be the last. That night, the power cut out. It was nearly midnight. The house went dark with a click and a sigh, the sudden absence of background hums and glows. Lana was in the middle of sending an email when the screen died. Outside, the wind had picked up, but there had been no storm. She checked the fuse box. Intact. Then the outdoor sensor lights blinked twice and shut down. Rocky growled from the front door. Lana grabbed her flashlight, heart pounding, and checked the generator. Someone had disabled the start mechanism. Wires had been carefully cut and removed, not vandalized but disassembled, as if by someone who knew what they were doing. She stood for a moment, breathing shallowly in the dark, the flashlight trembling in her grip. Her phone had no signal. She'd never felt the weight of isolation like she did in that moment. The next morning, a man from the power company showed up unannounced to verify a report of unauthorized modifications to the grid. Lana hadn't called. He checked the meter box and raised an eyebrow. "Strange. This tag's not from us." He peeled off a small plastic seal placed over the lock, blue, stamped with a code that didn't match the company's current issue. Someone had posed as a utility agent and interfered with her line. He reported the tampering and promised to send a formal notice to the local authorities. Lana thanked him, made him coffee, and added his statement to the growing evidence binder that now filled an entire drawer of her desk. Taylor, upon hearing the news, advised immediate installation of independent power options. Within the week, Lana had hired a small crew, recommended by Raul, to install solar panels and a second generator inside the barn. She also upgraded her satellite internet and added a third line of motion-detecting cameras, this time with cloud storage and multiple encrypted backups. It cost more than she had planned to spend in a year, but she no longer had the luxury of budgeting for peace. Survival required investment. Then came the complaints. 2 letters arrived in the same envelope, both unsigned but printed on the same stationery Karen had used previously. One accused Lana of creating visual pollution through unsightly industrial installations incompatible with the local aesthetic. The second warned of upcoming inspections related to animal noise violations, nighttime lighting disturbances, and unregulated pesticide use. It was laughable on the surface. Lana hadn't used any pesticides, and her lights were motion-triggered only. But it was clear someone was building a paper case against her, one that, if passed through enough desks, might eventually stick. Lana preemptively submitted copies of her energy system permits, livestock management logs, and all environmental reports to the appropriate agencies. She didn't wait for accusations. She beat them to the punch. At Taylor's recommendation, she also drafted a letter to the state's Agricultural Integrity Division, outlining the harassment pattern and its correlation with known land acquisition schemes. It was a defensive move, but a necessary one. Meanwhile, Sophie had regressed. The improvements of the past month unraveled under the pressure of a constant threat. She refused to sleep without every door locked and asked repeatedly whether they would have to move. Lana reassured her over and over that they were safe, but she no longer believed it fully herself. Every unfamiliar vehicle that passed the gate made her chest tighten. Every creak on the porch sent her reaching for the phone or the flashlight or both. One night she found Sophie outside on the steps, barefoot and shaking, because Rocky had gone outside and she didn't want him to be taken again. The final straw came in the form of silence. For 3 days, nothing happened. No letters, no vehicles, no sensor alerts. The air itself felt wrong. Too still, too suspended. On the 4th day, Lana's satellite uplink went down. The provider confirmed a localized interference anomaly, likely caused by a directional jammer. It was subtle, temporary, and highly illegal. Someone had the equipment and the intent to cut her off. That night, she heard movement near the barn, not just the usual animal noises, but deliberate footsteps. When she got there, rifle in hand, she found the back door ajar and a fresh set of boot prints in the straw. Nothing was stolen, nothing was broken, but a single photograph had been placed on the ground. Her and Sophie taken from outside the kitchen window. The message wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Lana stood in the barn, clutching the photo as Rocky paced behind her, restless and growling low in his throat. The next day, she forwarded the image to Taylor and Raoul. Taylor filed for an emergency court order to restrict any access to Lana's property by non-essential personnel. Raoul sent a formal request for federal surveillance support. The situation had moved beyond harassment. It was now a targeted, multi-pronged campaign to destabilize, intimidate, and potentially displace. And it was working. Except Lana was still there, and she wasn't planning on leaving. Lana had known from the beginning that Karen wasn't acting alone. There had always been a sense, intangible at first but undeniable now, that someone else was pulling strings behind the curtain. Karen, for all her venomous precision and passive-aggressive cruelty, lacked the subtlety for such a calculated campaign. The surveillance-level tactics, the document forgeries, the timing of the power disruptions and bogus inspections, none of that had the signature of a bitter neighbor. It had the fingerprints of institutional manipulation. But until now, Lana had lacked proof. That changed the morning she received the envelope from the Department of Agriculture. Not by mail, but hand-delivered by Agent Raul Vega himself, his face unreadable, his tone clipped by urgency. Inside the envelope was a copy of a grant amendment request, filed under Lana's parcel number, forged with her digital signature, and dated 2 weeks prior. The amendment falsely claimed that the federal conservation agreement protecting her land had been voluntarily surrendered, that the bulls were no longer in active study, and that the land was now cleared for commercial use pending local zoning. Approval? It was an elegant forgery. Raoul had nearly processed it before a discrepancy in the routing code caught his eye. That error had triggered a deeper verification process, and that had led him to Lana's front porch with the document in hand. Lana stood on the porch, stunned. She hadn't filed any amendment. The digital signature was a near-perfect replica, but slightly off in its timestamp metadata. Whoever had forged it had access to either her old legal files or to someone inside the department itself. Raoul was already 3 steps ahead. "This didn't come from someone on your side of the fence," he said grimly. "It was filed from a system in the regional planning office, the same network used by zoning boards and developers." Taylor was looped in immediately. Within hours, she assembled a multi-page brief outlining the pattern of harassment, the attempted forgery, and the clear conflict of interest exposed by the document's routing trail. She submitted it to the state's Agricultural Fraud Division, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Department of Justice. But even as the legal gears began to turn, Lana felt no satisfaction. She felt invaded. They had gone from poisoning dogs and threatening children to rewriting reality on paper, trying to erase her ownership through back-end bureaucracy. What struck Lana the hardest was how nearly successful the tactic had been. One unchecked box, one distracted official, and the protection for the bulls, and by extension her land, would have been dissolved. The trespassers would have returned with legal cover. The fences wouldn't have been enough. The bulls, as symbols of resistance, would have been slaughtered or displaced, and her daughter's safe haven turned into just another empty field slated for development. The illusion of rules had almost been used to bury her alive under false consent. That night Lana didn't sleep. She sat on the floor of the barn between 2 of the older bulls, their heavy breath like distant drums in the stillness. Rocky lay beside her, chin on his paws, watching her as if to say, "I'm still here." She thought of Sophie, curled upstairs, trusting, resilient but tired. Thought of her father's voice when he used to explain the purpose of the program, the way he said, "These animals, Lana, they don't just survive. They hold the land together." It wasn't about money or pride or some romantic vision of the countryside. It was about legacy, about continuity in the face of corrosion. And then she made a decision. They wouldn't just defend. They would counterattack. Lana reached out to the State Investigative Journalist Network using a contact Taylor provided, someone who specialized in land use corruption and small-town developer scams. The reporter, a woman named Molly Brandt, responded within a day and arrived at the ranch that weekend with a camera crew and a quiet determination in her eyes. She spent 6 hours with Lana, recording interviews, walking the property, filming the bulls, and reviewing redacted letters, federal documentation, and the forged amendment file. Molly had seen similar patterns. Rural families targeted by land consortiums using loopholes and political leverage. But she admitted that Lana's case had an unusually aggressive character. "Usually they try to buy you out," she said. "But this is systemic character assassination. They're trying to make you a public nuisance so the rest of the town will help squeeze you out." Molly's report aired on a regional news segment the following week and exploded online. Within days, Lana's inbox was flooded, not just with hate, but with support. Messages from other victims of land harassment, ranchers who had lost their homes to development pressure, attorneys offering assistance, former committee members anonymously confirming that Karen had boasted about clearing dead land for revival. One message stood out. A former zoning clerk who admitted he'd been asked to expedite documents tied to Lana's parcel but had refused after seeing the red flags. He sent screenshots of emails, one of which showed Karen CC'd alongside a project manager from a luxury real estate firm known for rural retreats. This wasn't just a hostile neighbor. This was a conspiracy. With Taylor's help, Lana submitted an official complaint to the State Attorney General's office requesting a grand jury inquiry into the attempted fraudulent transfer of federally protected land. It was a long shot, but it placed her case squarely on the radar of the state's legal apparatus. Simultaneously, Raoul filed a full incident report with the DOJ's Office of Civil Rights, including the forged signature and the attack on the service dog. The narrative was no longer isolated or local. It was growing into something larger, an investigation into how land theft was being normalized through red tape and small-town silence. But with exposure came retaliation. Sophie found it first, drawn in chalk on the sidewalk outside the gate. A crude depiction of a hanging dog. No note, just the image. It was deliberate, juvenile, and unmistakably malicious. Lana reported it, but she knew no one would be arrested. This was psychological warfare, a reminder that while legal wheels turned slowly, intimidation was instant. That night, Lana relocated Sophie's bed to the master bedroom and began sleeping with the windows latched and a flashlight in arm's reach. Molly returned twice, filming follow-ups and preparing a long-form documentary for an online investigative channel. Her crew captured drone footage of the ranch, shots of the surrounding empty properties, and one telling image, a private road that led to a cluster of new, prefabricated homes. All empty, all branded under the same development firm that had appeared in the zoning clerk's email. The company was preparing for a land acquisition that hadn't yet been approved, betting on Lana's collapse. But instead of folding, Lana became the eye of the storm. Neighbors who had once avoided her now sent casseroles, firewood, and envelopes of receipts showing committee fees used for private dinners, unexplained consulting expenses, and property maintenance contracts granted to shell companies tied to Karen's relatives. A web of quiet corruption was unraveling, thread by thread, in the most ordinary rural zip code imaginable. And in the center of it, a mother, a child, a dog, and a field of ancient bulls stood their ground. Not because they wanted to fight, but because the alternative was surrender, and that was never an option. The quiet that followed the news report was not peace. It was pressure, tight, strategic, and invisible to the outside world. Lana felt it in the air, in the strange look she now received at the feed store, in the way people paused too long when driving past her gate. The segment had painted a clear picture: a mother defending her land, her daughter, and a federally protected program from malicious interference. Yet, in small-town America, where whispers travel faster than broadband and silence can be a political statement, the response was split. Some residents sent flowers and notes of solidarity. Others turned away entirely, afraid perhaps of what support might cost them. Lana understood. Fear had currency out here, and Karen was still out there too, though now she appeared only through shadows. Her home remained unsold, but she hadn't been seen since the report aired. Taylor suspected she was operating through intermediaries, letting the development firm, Arbor Vale Holdings, do the next round of dirty work while she receded just enough to claim distance. It was a clever tactic. Delay, deny, disassociate. But the tactics themselves didn't stop. They escalated. Less visible, more dangerous. The first move came in the form of a legal notice, delivered not through mail but hand-delivered by a courier. The thick packet bore the letterhead of a prestigious law firm out of Houston, known for defending corporate clients against environmental lawsuits. Inside was a cease-and-desist order accusing Lana of reckless defamation, obstruction of economic activity, and unauthorized use of federal symbols and claims. They demanded she retract all statements made in the media and online. Remove all signage related to federal conservation, and halt any further interaction with press or public forums regarding the land. It was pure intimidation, wrapped in expensive formatting. Taylor responded within hours, shredding the language point by point and filing a preemptive motion in federal court to dismiss any claim of wrongdoing. Still, the message was clear. They were bringing in bigger teeth. Arbor Vale was going national with their pressure. The false amendment had failed, but now they were trying to starve Lana out with legal fees and procedural war. At the same time, the committee, still operating under a provisional structure while Cairn remained absent, began issuing new policy advisories. These weren't laws, but they carried the suggestion of power. Advisories about livestock containment, predator control, noise ordinances, and construction permits. All of them clearly targeted at her. Lana ignored them. She had no obligation to comply, but ignoring them didn't erase their effects. Contractors stopped returning her calls. One day, the propane supplier she'd used for months sent a terse letter informing her that, due to recent insurance changes, we regretfully must suspend delivery to unincorporated properties outside of committee jurisdiction. It was nonsense. Her coverage hadn't changed. Taylor investigated and discovered that a quiet campaign had begun. Pressure applied to businesses, veiled threats, rumors spreading among vendors. "They're trying to isolate you economically," she said, "make you radioactive." That same week, the eastern gate was cut. The lock lay on the ground, sawed clean in half. The trail cam had been disabled, lens smashed, power pulled. Lana walked the fence line slowly, heart thudding in her ears, Rocky tight against her side. Near the creek, she found tire tracks. Not from a ranch vehicle. These were deep, staggered, all-terrain. Someone had driven into her property at night. Not to steal, not to tag, but simply to send a message. "We can walk through your walls. We are not afraid of cameras or courts." Raul escalated the case to federal land enforcement and arranged for a mobile field technician to install covert motion sensors deep in the tree line. He recommended Lana stay inside at night and begin keeping a printed log of all activity on and around the property. Taylor, meanwhile, filed for a protective order barring any member of Arbor Vale or its subsidiaries from contacting or encroaching upon Lana's land without formal judicial permission. But the wheels of legal redress moved slowly, and the predators they were facing no longer wore business casual. They wore gloves and moved without headlights. Then came the sabotage. One morning, Lana opened the barn to find one of the bulls limping badly, his front right leg swollen and bloodied. A vet inspection revealed puncture wounds, shallow but deliberate, likely from a sharpened metal object placed on the ground. Near the edge of the pasture they found it, a handmade spike strip, half buried beneath hay. The type of device used in car chases, re-engineered to maim. There were no fingerprints, no witnesses, just a wounded animal and the heavy weight of targeted malice. Sophie cried for hours that night, curled in her mother's lap, whispering that they were going to kill all the animals and make them leave. Lana held her tighter than she ever had, whispered back lies about how everything would be okay, how the bad people would go to jail, how they would win. But she knew this wasn't about winning anymore. It was about endurance. Taylor filed an emergency injunction. Raul pulled strings to get a temporary wildlife enforcement detail assigned to the region. And Molly Brandt, the journalist, returned with her crew, this time staying overnight in a camper parked near the western field. "We're not just reporting now," she said. "We're documenting everything. If they escalate again, we'll have it on tape." Her cameras caught more than anyone expected. 2 nights later, infrared footage captured 3 figures entering the property from the southeast boundary. They wore dark clothing, moved in coordinated patterns, and carried tools. They avoided the visible motion lights but triggered the hidden sensors. Raul's team arrived within 20 minutes, but the intruders were already gone. What they left behind was chilling. A bag of lime and a crate of wildlife poison stashed near the water trough, unopened but positioned for easy use. It was premeditation, intent to kill not just livestock, but to destroy the entire habitat. The footage made its way into federal hands. The Department of the Interior issued a temporary buffer zone around Lana's ranch, classifying it as a priority conservation risk site. For the first time, there was a public acknowledgement. This was no longer a local dispute. This was an active ecological sabotage case. And yet the pushback didn't stop. Within a week, anonymous complaints flooded the state's Child Protective Services Division. Sophie wasn't in a traditional school. Sophie was seen outside near dangerous animals. Sophie's mother owned a firearm. It was a coordinated smear designed to weaponize the state against her. A caseworker arrived, tense but professional. Lana cooperated fully. She showed homeschooling documentation, medical records, ADA approvals, safety plans. Rocky sat patiently beside her, vest on, ears pricked. The caseworker left after 2 hours and closed the file the next day, but the message had landed. No part of her life was off limits. Taylor had seen enough. She filed a civil suit naming Arbor Vale Holdings, Karen Murray, and the local committee leadership, past and present, as conspirators in a campaign of harassment, trespass, defamation, and attempted environmental destruction. The suit was long, exhaustive, and packed with evidence. Drone footage, witness statements, financial records from whistleblowers, federal violations related to endangered species protections. The damages requested exceeded $5 million. It wasn't about the money. It was about consequence. The news spread quickly. Reporters picked up the story. Activist groups reached out with offers of support. A local radio host devoted a segment to reading the court filing out loud, line by line, his voice thick with disbelief. People who had ignored Lana before now spoke up. A retired state trooper came forward with an affidavit stating that he'd been asked by a mutual friend of Karen's to perform a wellness check on the property after hours, but refused. Another rancher, a woman from a neighboring county, admitted she had sold under similar pressure 5 years earlier, and had watched her land turned into a private golf retreat within 6 months. The tide was turning, but the danger remained. On the eve of the court's initial hearing to review the emergency claims, Lana received one final message. It wasn't a letter or a call. It was a fire. Someone set a blaze along the northern fence. Dry brush ignited in a perfect arc, fanned by wind. It took an hour for the volunteer fire crew to control it. No structures were lost, no animals harmed, but the land was scorched. Lana stood beside the fire chief watching smoke curl into the black sky and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. They had tried letters. They had tried silence. They had tried to kill her dog, poison her bulls, terrify her child, erase her land, and finally burn her out. And she was still standing, not just because of lawyers or journalists or agents, but because she had something they didn't. Roots, real ones, set deep into the soil. Blood, memory, legacy. And now, a fire inside her that would not go out. The courtroom was colder than Lana had imagined. Not in temperature, though the air conditioning buzzed faintly overhead, but in tone, in atmosphere, in the hard stares of strangers seated behind polished tables who had never stepped foot on her land, never stood beside a wounded animal or comforted. A shaking child in the middle of the night, yet now held her life between their fingers. The walls were sterile, the lighting artificial, and the bench at the front elevated just enough to remind everyone who did and didn't hold power in this moment. Lana sat beside Taylor, hands clasped so tightly in her lap her knuckles had gone white, but she kept her face calm, her eyes steady, unwilling to give them anything they could spin into instability or weakness. Opposite her sat 3 attorneys representing Arbor Vale Holdings, another for the former committee, and a local attorney, arrogant, smug, representing Karen Murray, who was not present. A medical excuse had been filed on her behalf. Stress-induced fatigue. Of course, she had poisoned a child's dog, vandalized protected territory, and nearly burned a field to ash. But when forced to face the consequences, her body had suddenly become too frail to endure the pressure. Lana had no pity for her. The judge was methodical, slow but piercing. He listened to Taylor's presentation without interruption, occasionally raising an eyebrow but rarely speaking. Taylor laid out the timeline, meticulously annotated. The forged grant amendment, the evidence of digital tampering, the trespassing reports, surveillance footage, the poisoning, the harassment, the forged survey flags, the hacked utilities, the fire. Each piece of evidence stacked upon the next like bricks in a wall until the structure of intent and conspiracy was undeniable. She quoted state law, federal statute, conservation codes, ADA regulations. She showed pictures, photos of Rocky's injury, the burned pasture, Sophie's trembling hands as she held onto her dog after finding the chalk drawing of a hanging leash. At no point did Taylor grandstand. She didn't need to. The facts were brutal enough. The defense tried to dismiss the case as an unfortunate series of misunderstandings. They attempted to cast Lana as paranoid, uncooperative, someone who had refused to work within community guidelines. They claimed the federal protections were vague, the documents confusing to the average citizen. One attorney went so far as to imply that Sophie's condition had been exaggerated for sympathy. That was the only time Lana spoke. She stood, looked directly at the man, and said quietly, "If you had spent a single night in our home, listening to my daughter cry in her sleep because she thought someone would come kill her dog again, you'd understand what real damage feels like." The judge allowed it. No gavel, no objection, just silence. Raul Vega testified next, describing the procedural fraud attempt in stark terms. "This wasn't just a violation of administrative protocol," he said. "It was a coordinated effort to undermine federal conservation law for private gain." He confirmed the presence of the unmarked surveillance devices, the jammed signal, the sabotage to electrical systems. He didn't make guesses. He stuck to what could be proven. But the pattern was clear. Then came Molly Brandt, the journalist. She presented video evidence, interviews with other landowners, the recorded statements of whistleblowers who had identified Karen's connections to Arbor Vale, and the testimony of a zoning clerk who had provided emails linking the development firm to the land committee. One frame from the footage showed Karen at a dinner table, laughing with the same project manager who had submitted a rezoning request for the properties adjacent to Lana's ranch. Another clip showed her discussing clearing the field, in language too precise to be innocent. The turning point came when a man stood at the back of the room, wearing a suit several years out of fashion and shoes scuffed by fieldwork. His name was Dennis Rourke, a retired USDA enforcement agent who had once reviewed conservation site compliance in the region. He had heard about the case and traveled to testify voluntarily. In a low, firm voice, he told the court that he had flagged Lana's property years ago as particularly sensitive, that her father's work had been considered foundational in the restoration of genetically rare Welsh bulls. He confirmed that dissolving that status through any legal loophole would have required multiple approvals, none of which had occurred. Someone tried to rewrite a federal designation, he said. That's not a clerical error. That's a crime. When the court recessed for lunch, Lana walked outside alone. She didn't eat. She didn't sit. She stood under the shade of an old oak across from the courthouse, watching pedestrians pass, trying to remember what normal used to feel like. Sophie was home with a friend from church. Rocky was with her, of course. Lana had insisted on it. She didn't want Sophie near any of this. Not the cold architecture of law, not the forced civility of courtroom theater. She wanted her daughter to remember the land, the animals, the laughter in the barn when the bulls kicked hay at each other, not the way people in suits tried to argue that trauma was just perception. Back inside, the judge returned with his ruling. He didn't read a full opinion. That would come later. He spoke plainly, without embellishment. The evidence provided shows a clear and sustained effort to interfere with federally protected conservation land, to intimidate its lawful occupants, and to falsify administrative records in pursuit of commercial interests. The plaintiff has demonstrated not only injury, but active sabotage. This court issues an injunction barring any representative of Arbor Vale Holdings, Karen Murray, or related parties from entering, altering, or contacting any portion of the plaintiff's property indefinitely, pending further review. He paused, then added, the evidence related to potential criminal activity, document forgery, attempted environmental harm, and civil rights violations is hereby referred to the appropriate federal authorities for investigation. It was not a final verdict. It was not a check or a parade or a public apology, but it was validation. It was protection. It was the law acknowledging what Lana had known all along. She hadn't imagined it. She hadn't overreacted. And she wasn't alone. Taylor turned to her and smiled. Not the smile of victory, but of relief. "They're going to run now," she said. "Arbor Vale, Karen, the committee. They'll try to cut ties, downplay their involvement. But this ruling? It's a stake in the ground." Lana nodded slowly. "That's all I ever wanted." When she stepped outside, the wind had shifted. The heat had broken. Somewhere in the distance, a thunderstorm rolled over the hills, distant enough to feel cinematic. She called Sophie. Her daughter answered on the first ring. "Are we done, Mom?" she asked. Lana looked up at the courthouse, the clouds, the flag flapping against the sky. "Not done," she said, "but safe." In the months that followed the hearing, the dust began to settle, but not all at once and not quietly. The injunction had the intended effect. The immediate pressure ceased. No more anonymous letters, no surveillance vans, no late-night trespassers. The committee, such as it still was, dissolved under the weight of subpoenas and resignations. Arbor Vale Holdings pulled out of the area within weeks of the judge's ruling, their website quietly erasing all mention of their proposed developments in the region. Karen's property was finally listed by an out-of-county agent, the sign swinging listlessly in the breeze, and though she never returned to her home, her name became synonymous in the area with everything rotten that had been festering behind the guise of local order. There was no redemption arc, no public reckoning, just a slow retreat into silence as if the land itself was rejecting her memory. Lana did not celebrate. She repaired. She walked the fence lines, mended gates, replaced scorched grass, and reinforced the barn's doors with new locking systems. She resumed the conservation routines her father had once followed so strictly: daily tracking logs for the bulls, quarterly DNA samples, seasonal pasture rotation. The Department of Agriculture sent new agents to update her equipment and offered additional funding through the Rural Wildlife Protection Grant. Where once her requests had been buried under red tape, now they were prioritized, handled with care. The field where the fire had nearly taken root was reseeded with native grass, and over time green began to return, shy but persistent. Sophie began to heal in tandem with the land. Slowly, cautiously, but visibly, she returned to sleeping in her own room. Rocky nestled at her side, his fur now grown back over the scar where they had shaved him. She began painting again, not just sketching, but large, expressive work. One canvas showed the ranch house under a stormy sky, with shadowy figures standing at the edge of a glowing pasture. But in the center, a girl stood holding a golden dog by the collar, both of them facing forward, unflinching. When Lana saw it, she didn't cry. She felt something settle inside her, a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying lifting at last. Taylor continued to manage the civil case, and as federal investigations gained traction, more details emerged. The forgery attempt had been traced to a subcontractor with previous ties to zoning officials in 3 other counties. All cases where land had mysteriously lost its environmental protection status just before being bought and flipped. Arrests were made, quietly and without fanfare, but significant enough to make local news. One headline read, Fake paper trail uncovered in statewide land fraud ring. Lana's name was not mentioned, but those who knew the story recognized its origin. Molly's documentary aired online and gained traction quickly, particularly among advocacy groups concerned with rural displacement, environmental fraud, and disability rights. It framed Lana not as a victim, but as a case study in resistance. A person who had endured not because of exceptional power, but because of unrelenting will. She had not solved the mystery alone. She had relied on experts, on records, on the law. But she had stood when it counted. The segment's final shot showed Lana walking beside the bulls, Sophie laughing in the background, and the narration ended with the line, "Sometimes holding your ground means more than standing still. Sometimes it means refusing to be moved." Lana never asked for fame. She never sought attention. But one afternoon, while checking her mailbox, she found a small package wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was a metal plate, engraved simply Stevens Conservation Field, federally protected since 1991, restored 2025. There was no note. She mounted it beside the barn entrance. The new year brought quiet. The first true quiet in nearly 18 months. No lawsuits, no strange vehicles, no calls from Taylor with urgent updates. The silence didn't feel ominous anymore. It felt earned. Sophie's laugh returned to its full, bright sound. Rocky, older now, still kept watch, but his alertness had softened. He spent more afternoons basking in sun patches than scanning the woods. And Lana allowed herself, for the first time, to consider the future not as a battleground, but as a garden. She began hosting small visits for local schools, letting kids see the bulls up close, teaching them what conservation looked like not in theory, but in texture and breath. One boy asked, "Why do they move so slow?" And Lana had smiled and said, "Because they know there's no need to run if you already belong." And she did. She belonged, not because anyone gave her permission, not because the courts told her she could stay, but because she never left. Because even when everything around her told her to yield, she didn't. And now, the land answered her back. Not with words, but with roots that held firm, with grass that grew green again, with a daughter who slept soundly, and a horizon that no longer felt like a threat. Justice hadn't come with a single gavel strike or a headline. It had come like the seasons, slow, resistant, inevitable. And Lana Stevens stood in the center of it, not victorious, but whole.